My story today is going to start with a confession, which is I was truly the ultimate homebody as a kid. I guess you can call me kind of like a mama's boy. I grew up with Greek parents in the 70s. It was just the perfect time to be a kid. And I definitely had my, battle scars from being a kid like everybody does. But overall, I had a pretty idyllic childhood. I love my friends. I love my family. I had everything I needed. I didn't need to go anywhere. However, as the years went on and I got closer to high school graduation, I knew, of course, I was going to have to go to college. I was a good student. I was in the National Honor Society, had good grades and everything else. So it was inevitable that I was going to go to college. But when it got closer and closer, particularly the summer before college, I admitted to myself, I really didn't want to go. I had no desire. I was like, why would I want to go somewhere else now? But again, I knew I had to. So I was going to Lehigh University, which I didn't know anything about. I had visited, I think, once before that, but for me, it was just, the big unknown. And, I was also, apart from just the fact that, I didn't have any desire to change my life at all at that time because everything was like really good. It was also like I was a little scared, I have to say, and not just sort of socially and going someplace where I didn't know anybody and had to make new friends and all, but even academically. As I said, I was a good student, but I went to a big public high school. It wasn't very hard, and I just felt like I was, going to be outplayed at Lehigh. I felt like I was just the competition was going to be stiff for me for whatever reason. So I think it was the day before my parents were going to take me. I rode my bike to my aunt's house, which is where my grandmother lived, and she lived about maybe 6 miles from our house. So I'd ride my bike there a lot, and I'd pop in on my grandmother and my aunt and uncle every so often. So this was the last day. I was saying bye to my grandma. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table and we were talking and I said, and by the way, she spoke very little English. She spoke kind of broken English, but enough to get by. And I spoke just enough Greek to get by. And I explained to her, I was like, Yaya, which means grandmother in Greek. I don't want to go. I said it probably in Greek. Then θέλω να πάω. I don't want to go. And like, I think she got it. And, she looked me in the eye and she gave me like just the best piece of advice, as simple as it was. She just said to me in her broken English, don't be afraid. And she said it very definitively. And she didn't explain why I shouldn't be afraid. She didn't justify it. She just said it like it was a directive. And that's how I took it. Like, okay. I'm not going to be afraid. But I knew where it was coming from, knowing my grandmother. My grandmother was a very spiritual person. She was, we were Greek Orthodox. We always went to church with her and everything else. And I knew, God and Jesus were the center of her life. So when she said to me, don't be afraid, it was, just like everything in life, don't be afraid. God is with you. And in the end, it's all going to work out because eventually you're going to enter God's kingdom and, all the challenges, all the things that happen here on earth aren't going to have any lasting impact. So that was all packed in that one statement. It was years later when I thought about that, and I thought about those words a lot, beyond that one incident of going to college for the first time. And I was thinking about like my grandma, Yaya Domna, on her last, day or so, on this planet. By then I was a senior in college, and I went home to see her, and my mom and dad said, look, you got to come see your grandmother. She's not going to last more than a day or so. So I went to see her, and at that time, I think it was the same day, the priest came to read her last rites. So, the Greek Orthodox priest doesn't just say like a little prayer. Everything's long and protracted and singing, and he had the censer and the crosses and the icons and all that. And my grandmother, she kind of said the prayers along with him, and she sang right along with him. And I thought to myself, there she is, like right on the edge of of life, ready to, enter the next world. And, she was going in with both eyes open, with no fear, because she had, very strong faith. So when I left the next day to go to college, that's what I took with me, was my grandmother's advice of, don't be afraid. The next day, we loaded up the car. My mom and dad were going to drive me. So Lehigh it was about 3 hours from where I grew up in Connecticut. And I knew it was in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I knew it was far enough away that I couldn't just come home for the weekend, or my parents couldn't just visit me. So, I think we had they call it a pacing break in October for a couple of days. So for the most part, I was gone for the semester. And, so we left. My sister came along for the ride. She and I were very close. She was only a year older than me, but really tight. And she took it kind of hard when I left. She was going to college nearby to where we lived in Connecticut. So she was going to be home with my mom and dad. And I got to say, she cried like the entire trip to Lehigh, which didn't make it easier on me because I felt bad, leaving her as well. But when we got there, we pulled up. The dorm I was in was Taylor Hall. It was an all-guys dorm. It was this giant block of reinforced concrete. It had some ornamentation, but it was this old gray concrete building. And the inside was crumbling. The lighting was really poor. It kind of smelled. What I found out was this was the last year they were going to have Taylor. They couldn't knock it down because it was reinforced concrete. It would have cost too much. So they were going to renovate the whole thing. So this was the last year it was going to operate as an all-boys dorm. And I honestly think that the guys that were in there, including myself, were the ones that didn't fill out the paperwork for the housing until last minute. So I think you had a certain category of student there, who just kind of blew everything off. Everybody's a little crazy, but anyway, we unloaded the car, which wasn't much. Back then, people didn't have, parents didn't give their kids air conditioners and rugs and, lamps and lighting and, all these conveniences and little dresser drawer things. And back then, it was I had 2 suitcases, probably a poster or 2. I had my stereo, my little stuffed animal bunny, which was a teddy bear. And that was maybe a couple pictures, and that was it. So the unloading process was quick. And I remember when I was ready to say goodbye to my mom, she was a little teary-eyed. And I just said to her, I hate it. I couldn't say it too loud because I didn't want everybody to hear me. I think I was a wimp. But I was like, I hate it. I hate it here. I don't want to be here, which was not very nice to do to my poor mom because I know she was probably worried to death about me. My dad was kind of like, well, just stick it out a week. You can do it. Just stick it out a week. Take it 1 week at a time. But I said goodbye, and I was just sick to my stomach. So I think it was that day, or maybe the day later, they had the welcome convocation in this big auditorium called, it was Grace Hall, and I remember. They had the parade of, it wasn't alumni, it was the sophomores, the juniors, and they had the class flags, and the band was playing, and everybody comes in, and all the freshmen, everybody's, happy and cheering, and everybody yelling, and it was it was like a big pep rally, and I was just not into it. I was I didn't want to be there. And I remember, it was just kind of what are they so happy about? What's up with that? And even the night before, I remember, my first night, sitting in my bed, we had the windows open. There was no air conditioning. You could hear the other freshmen, the other kids, outside yelling and screaming and partying, like they were just so happy to be there. And I remember thinking, why aren't they sad? Did they not have friends at home? They don't even know each other. That was my reaction. How could they be having so much fun together? It's they just met, And it was funny because I remember at that time what my dad had told me. My dad, he enlisted for the Navy to fight in World War II. And he said, the day he left, it was very, very sad. My grandfather was crying and everything else. But my dad got on the bus to go to the center where you check in and all that, first day in the Navy. And when he was on the bus, he said, all the other guys were yelling and cheering and yay, we're going to, whatever. And my dad felt the same. He said I was just kind of sitting there by myself and just sad, crying, whatever. I just thought yeah, he and I cut from the same cloth. So I felt like a little bit affirmed, feeling like, all right, my dad, he experienced the same thing I did. Probably had a super close family. I'm sure he did. Grew up with my grandmother and everything else. So anyway, I remember, practically after like the first day I got there, just couldn't wait until it was like my day to actually call home. So I was allowed one telephone call a week. I call collect. And the rooms, our dorm rooms didn't have, nobody had phones. So there was one pay phone. It was in the hall of my dorm. And, I had a understanding with my parents. Sunday night, I would call collect. They would accept the charges, and that's when I talked to them, which apparently was like the popular time for kids to call home, because Sunday night, there was like this line waiting to talk on the payphone. So, it's not like you had any privacy, and you also know that people are waiting. So you don't want to talk too long. You had to talk kind of quietly, because you don't want people hearing. So that was it. I got one call a week. I'll say the one thing I was very thankful for that was really a blessing was that, I had two roommates. A couple guys across the hall were just the greatest guys. I made friends with them pretty quickly, and they were just kind, nice people. They weren't the cool kids. No egos. They were kind of dorky, I gotta say, but that's kind of exactly what I needed. Just safe, very supportive. There was no competition. It was just, we just, clicked, really early on in the process. So again, like that was the thing that really got me through, I think the hardest part, which were like the first 2 or 3 weeks. I think what made adjusting to college life particularly hard for me was, given my background as like a Greek American, very sheltered, kind of like mama's boy, homebody. It was the nature of Lehigh itself, that college. It was sort of off the charts in terms of being sort of a wild party school. In fact, I think it was, and I mentioned this in another video, I think it was, I don't know if it was Playboy or Sports Illustrated. They always had an annual list of the big party schools. And they ranked them, the top 20 or whatever. And Lehigh was always, there was like a footnote that said like Lehigh was in a class by itself. And I think the reason for that was, it was traditionally a all male school. So by the time I'd gotten there, in 1980, it was a little more balanced, but it was still like maybe 2/3 male. And the vast majority of the men were in fraternities. And when you looked at the campus, it by the way, it was an absolutely beautiful campus, probably the prettiest campus I've ever seen of any college. But the bottom, say 2/3 is well, the school is built on the side of a mountain in South Bethlehem, and the bottom 2/3 is like all the student, the buildings and the classrooms and the administrative offices and buildings and everything. And then the top part, the top of the hill, was this windy road with 33 fraternities just lining it, like one after the other. And they were these really big, beautiful, from the outside, sort of mansions. And those were the fraternities. I say from the outside because the insides were like gross. But anyway, so that was it. And, that the fraternity culture, given that they were all just concentrated together, like right there on campus, and that was the entire social life, it lent for just this crazy party atmosphere where it was literally like the inmates took over the asylum. There were like no rules. And, back then, kids were pretty crazy. And even the school, the administration itself, I mean, it was just that kind of wild party culture was so ingrained in the history of the school. I think the administration, they played into it as well. Like I remember, just as an example, our freshman picnic, it was like maybe the second day we were there, second day we were there, they had the freshman picnic, and the school sponsored, they had beer trucks. Now the drinking age was 21 in Pennsylvania, and they were, basically providing alcohol to, freshmen 3 years under the drinking age. So, and I'm not saying that as a criticism of the Lehigh administration. It was a sign of the times, but it was also just a sign of the Lehigh culture, very specifically. And one thing that added to sort of my stress in terms of trying to adjust to college life and being away from home was, at that school, you didn't get a chance to like sort of get your bearings before starting to decide whether you want to join a fraternity and doing the whole fraternity rush thing. And that was critical because at Lehigh, as I said, the vast majority of the guys joined fraternities. And if you didn't join a fraternity, you were pretty much not part of just the regular, college life there. You kind of had to. And they started Rush. They were called open houses where you would visit, the fraternities. That started, I think it was like maybe the first or second Sunday after you got there. So you didn't even get a chance to settle in. And it was like, the open houses were in 3 consecutive Sundays. So they took all the fraternities, broke them up into 3 groups. And, the first Sunday was open houses for 1/3 and so on. So if you missed one of those Sundays, you were basically disqualified from 1/3 of the fraternity, from being considered for 1/3 of fraternity. So you had to start that process like right off the bat, which, again, for me, that was just like too much too soon. So all that just added to my stress. And I have to say, I was kind of miserable. I mean, I was homesick. I was just unhappy. I was kind of, I whined a lot. I complained a lot. I'm sure I was really annoying. I know I was. I think people told me that. But, I got to say, I think some people got a kick out of it. It was kind of my shtick, and people like me. I'm very social. And so I remember there was this one group of girls, it was Jan and Diane and then their friend Pam. There were 3 of them. And they just thought I was just funny. They just thought I was just quirky and weird, and they just loved my whole whatever shtick, I guess you call it. And my guy friends called them like Spencer's groupies because they would come to our dorm room and they'd plop down and just laugh and whatever. And the reason why I'm even bringing that up is because like at some point, not too long after I got there, I decided I don't know what motivated me to do this, but I decided I was going to run for class president. Again, I was so unhappy and miserable. You would think like that would be the last thing I'd want to do, but I just, for whatever reason, I was like, I ran for class president. And, Jan, Diane, and Pam, my groupies, they like supported me. And, when I ran, I was not one of the cool kids. I remember I ran against like a couple guys that were. There was one guy's name was John. I won't say his last name, but he eventually became a brother at, the definitely the most sophisticated, all the good-looking, rich football players. They called it the Lodge. It was Kaisai. He ran against me, and a bunch of other like really popular, kids that became popular right away. But I had this idea that I was going to like make these little index cards with my name and say vote for me, and I was going to like knock on doors in the dorms, which I did. And Jan and Diane and Pam, they just lobbied for me. They put up signs, and I remember. One of our 2 dining halls was called Rathbone. And, you walk in from the back and from the front, the front is like 2 stories off the ground and it was all glass, beautiful glass. You could, see out into Bethlehem. But there was this little ledge that went around it. And, Jan, Diane, and Pam put up my campaign posters on the outside of the glass. And I think people were like, man, how did he get out there, and put all those. So I think that kind of impressed people. But at the end of the day, I don't know how I got elected. I got elected class president. So, and also, through Fraternity Rush, my very close friend from high school, his name was John, he rushed fraternities with me. And one of the fraternities, one of the brothers was this guy, Mark, who was also from our hometown, Trumbull, Connecticut. And Mark was, center of the football team. The fraternity was Sigma Chi, which was, I would say, the most popular party-oriented, crazy fraternity on campus. But Mark, he was so loyal to we called it the Trumbull Pride, and he just basically got us in and, introduced us to everybody, and it was like a done deal. So, it's kind of like, in some ways, ironic. I was president of the class. I was, became, a pledge at the most popular fraternity of the 33 fraternities on campus. I developed a lot of friends, but I was still kind of, I don't want to say miserable, but I was still homesick, and I still wasn't really happy. And I got to say, it probably took until maybe my senior year at Lehigh, when I finally felt like the cord was like completely cut and I was on my own and I just didn't think about being home. It took that long for me. Here's the point of all this. I had no desire to leave my nice, happy home in the summer of 1980 and go to college. I was just so happy there. It was safe, it was secure, but I knew I had to go. It was inevitable. I felt like I had no choice. And if I didn't go, it would have been for all the wrong reasons. Fear of the unknown, just wanting the nice, safe, easy way out. And if I had done that and just hadn't gone or just dropped out like soon after, it would have changed the course of my life really for the worse. As my grandmother said, you can't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And what did she really mean by that? She meant, don't give in to fear. God is with you. God will carry you through, even life's challenges. You'll get through. The point is, courage isn't about not being scared. You can't control whether or not you're scared. Courage is about acting in the face of fear. There's a great saying that I'll never forget. It is, speak up even if your voice is shaking. So even if you're embarrassed or afraid that your voice is going to shake and people are going to think you're scared or timid or whatever, speak up anyway. Say your piece. It's okay that your voice is shaking. That takes courage. And the other important point I want to make is, if you're the parents of a child who is a homebody, kind of a mama's boy or a mama's girl, and doesn't want to go away, doesn't want to leave the nest, you got to push them. It's maybe one of the hardest things you might have to do as a parent, but it's for their own good. If you truly, love them enough to put them through that discomfort and know that they'll get through it, particularly if they're kids of faith and if you're a family of faith. They'll know that, God will get them through that. And in the long run, they're going to be better off for it. So just, the end of my story, this is the ending of my story, which is, right after I graduated from Lehigh, I went right to grad school. And I got into University of Michigan. And I was about ready to leave. It was, probably end of August. This was 1984. And my mom drove me to the bus station where I was going to take the bus to Newark Airport in New Jersey and then fly to Detroit and then, go to my first day at Michigan. And I was so excited, not that I was happy to leave my mom or my dad, whatever, but I just couldn't wait. And as I was pulling out of the bus station, my mom was waving to me and she was crying. And this lady who was sitting in the seat in front of me, she turned around and she was crying, just looking at my mother. And I felt bad for my mom, of course, but I remember thinking I was so psyched to go to Michigan. And it was truly by that point, the cord had been cut. I didn't feel like I wanted to be home at that point. I was looking forward to my next adventure. And by the way, I loved Ann Arbor. I had the best 2 years of probably of my life. But that's a story for another day. But so that's it for now. And we'll see you next time.